All right, good evening, folks, and welcome to another edition of the Sydney Saxophone Network Q&A sessions. Now, this is a little bit different to our regular format. I thought we'd try something a little bit different, and it's a very interesting topic we're going to be looking at this evening, and it's actually something that I think every saxophone player in Australia should certainly look into, as it is quite a historical significance to what we do and what has sort of come before us, and it's an important topic. What can I say? It's an important topic. So it's a instead of a well, it will be a Q&A at the end, but we're going to be kicking it off with a presentation. And our guest this evening is Nessyah Gallagher, and Nessyah has. I'll read the blurb here, so excuse the glasses. She holds she holds several degrees in saxophone performance and music education from the Northwestern University, where she completed a bachelor's, ethnomusicology from the University of Miami, saxophone performance from Shenandoah Conservatory, and is currently studying a PhD in musicology at the University of Melbourne, where she is currently based and is writing a musicology thesis on the history of concert saxophone in Australia, which I think is something that is sorely and desperately needed, because there's so much fantastic and rich history of the concert saxophone here in Australia, and there's a lot of stuff out there that I certainly am not aware of, and I'm sure there's a lot of people in the same boat. Now, you're probably wondering who this bloke is on my filing cabinet. It's a little bit blurry, but this is actually a photo of the person that we'll be discussing this evening, who is Peter Clinch. Now, for those who don't know, Peter Clinch is actually a fairly significant figure in saxophone here in Australia. And I know personally, I was first made aware of him actually through his saxophone quartet. There was a CD at the Sydney Con Library when I was a young student. And I thought, Australian Saxophone Quartet, this is really cool. And I had to listen to it, and yeah, it was amazing. And then from there, a couple of his solo albums as well, and it was just a really eye-opening experience for me, because I had, unfortunately, I'd never heard of him until I actually started at university. But I digress. So this evening's presentation, Nessyah is going to be discussing what is the topic that she's called the Australian-French Saxophone Connection, letters between Peter Clinch and Jean-Marie Londeix, who is also a fairly significant figure in saxophone. I'll just read you a very brief outline of the abstract, just to sort of give a bit of context of what we're discussing this evening, and then I'll pass it over to Nessyah. So this is an abstract written by her. Compared to the United States and Europe, very little has been written about the Australian saxophone. Yet Australian saxophonists and saxophone music deserve greater global attention. Saxophonist Peter Clinch became internationally acclaimed for his performing, teaching, and research into the connections between the body and performance for single reed musicians. Clinch's international connections and activities, such as participating and helping organise the World Saxophone Congress between 1982 and 1992, brought Australian saxophone music to the attention of some of the most significant concert saxophonists from around the world at the time. And this includes figures such as Marcel Mule, Jean-Marie Londeix, Eugene Rousseau, and Ryo Noda. It is through the personal connections made at these congresses that pieces such as the William Lovelock Sonata were performed and became known by saxophonists around the world. So I'm going to hand it over to our guest this evening, and without further ado, Nessyah, thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me, Nathan.
That's right. So I just might get you to. Nessyah has prepared a presentation, and I'll be getting her to run it through. So I'll just get her to set it up now, and then we'll just kick it off whenever you're ready.
Yep, I'm actually. I'll share my screen in a moment, but before we really get into that, so good evening, everyone, and thank you so much for being here and attending my virtual presentation. And as Nathan mentioned and introduced me so wonderfully, I am Nessyah Gallagher, and I'm a PhD student at the University of Melbourne. And my research focuses on the saxophone in Australia. Now, before I show you my slideshow, I thought you might be interested in seeing a really cool poster that I was just given by Peter Clinch's daughter, Robin Clinch. So this is the Yamaha poster of Peter Clinch. And as you can see at the bottom, it indeed says Yamaha. Can you guys all see that? And there's an inscription at the bottom because he was a Yamaha artist, and the inscription says, "Reader in music at the University of Melbourne Institute of Education, a highly respected performer and teacher, performs exclusively as a soloist and with chamber ensembles throughout the world." I'm sorry, performs extensively as a soloist and with chamber ensembles throughout the world. So that's his official Yamaha artist poster right there. Thought you guys would be interested in having a quick look at that so you can see the face behind the name. Just give me a moment here. So some time ago, I discovered that there was a series of letters exchanged between the Australian saxophonist Peter Clinch and the distinguished French saxophonist Jean-Marie Londeix. This letter exchange occurred between 1972 and 1992. Their correspondence was initiated by Clinch when he was given a grant from the Australian Arts Council to travel outside Australia to study reed wind instrument performance. As Clinch admired Londeix for his recordings, musical aesthetic, and love for modern repertoire, he wrote to Londeix asking for help with his research. According to Clinch's student Ian Godfrey, Clinch saw Londeix as a kind of kindred spirit, as both were interested in extended techniques on the saxophone, as well as playing Baroque transcriptions on the saxophone and promoting new repertoire for the instrument. The aim of my presentation today is to demonstrate how this correspondence initiated a fruitful relationship that helped to bring the Australian saxophone to the attention of the worldwide saxophone community and brought many aspects of French saxophone music and teaching to Australia. I'll begin with some background on Londeix and Clinch, followed by an explanation of why this correspondence was so significant for the Australian saxophone community. Then I'll detail Clinch's efforts to bring French saxophone method books and music to Australia, and conclude by explaining the impact of the relationship between Clinch and Londeix on the Australian saxophone community, particularly in Melbourne. French saxophonist and teacher Jean-Marie Londeix was born in Arvers, France in 1932 and currently lives in Bordeaux. At the age of 88, he has attended and still attends saxophone conferences, competitions, and events around the world. From 1951 to 1953, he studied with the saxophone master Marcel Mule at the Conservatoire de Paris, and from 1971 to 2001, he was the saxophone teacher at the Bordeaux Conservatoire. Londeix collaborated closely with many composers to encourage the creation of new, high-quality works for the saxophone. He worked with Edison Denisov, Henri Tomasi, Pierre-Max Dubois, Paul Creston, and Christian Loba, among others, creating works that became some of the most famous and most frequently performed saxophone music in existence. Over 250 pieces have been dedicated to Londeix. In addition to teaching, performing, and commissioning new music, Jean-Marie Londeix has written books on the history of the saxophone, saxophone pedagogy, and saxophone techniques. His book, Hello, Mr. Sax, from 1989, is still a highly regarded reference for advanced saxophonists learning extended techniques. Londeix has also served as the director of the International Saxophone Committee, which organizes the World Saxophone Congresses. And he hosted the fourth Congress in 1974, which I'll speak about shortly. Clarinetist, saxophonist, educator, composer, and conductor Peter Clinch was born in 1930 in Geraldton, Western Australia. By age 17, in 1947, Clinch was a member of the clarinet section of the Perth Symphony Orchestra In 1953, Clinch settled briefly in Melbourne and joined the Royal Australian Air Force. Clinch returned to Perth in 1966 and joined the Western Australian Symphony Orchestra, playing clarinet, saxophone, bass clarinet, English horn, and occasionally even percussion when required. He also completed a bachelor's degree in composition and a master's degree in clarinet performance through the University of Western Australia, or UWA. It was during his master's degree that he received a grant from the Australian Arts Council to travel to research his thesis. And this impending travel was what sparked his first letters to Jean-Marie Londeix. Clinch visited Bordeaux and met Londeix early in 1973. During this visit, the two discussed the need to include a list of published Australian saxophone works in a supplement to Londeix's book, 125 Years of Music for Saxophone. In his letter from 13 April 1973, Clinch explained that he was working to get this information sent to Londeix. And we can reasonably assume that any Australian works listed in Londeix's second edition of the book, or his 150 Years of Music for Saxophone, are in some way due to these initial efforts of Peter Clinch. From this same letter, we also know that during Clinch's visit that year, Londeix invited Clinch to come to the 1974 World Saxophone Congress as a soloist. After his travels, Clinch moved back to Melbourne, where he was appointed lecturer in music at the Melbourne State College, a teacher's college. How exciting it must have been for his first students at the Melbourne State College to learn that their teacher would soon be flying to Bordeaux to perform as a soloist at the Fourth World Saxophone Congress. I'll discuss Clinch's performance at the Fourth World Saxophone Congress in more detail in just a few minutes. Clinch brought his experiences from the World Saxophone Congress back to Australia. And in 1977, he organized the first Australian National Saxophone Seminar, which was held in Melbourne from April 9 to 11. As with the World Saxophone Congress, Clinch arranged for prominent local and international saxophonists to attend, including Canadian saxophonist Paul Brodie. Clinch continued to work at the Melbourne State College during its transition into the Melbourne College of Advanced Education, or MCAE, in 1982, and through its amalgamation with the University of Melbourne in 1988. In 1994, Peter Clinch was diagnosed with cancer and went on long service leave. He died on 6 June 1995. Hundreds attended his funeral service, which, as Roz McMillan mentioned in Clinch's obituary for The Age, was a, quote, testimony to the admiration and respect he commanded. The correspondence between Clinch and Londeix is significant for two main reasons. First, it explains the inclusion of French saxophone pedagogy in Australian saxophone teaching. Second, it highlights the importance of Clinch's participation in the Fourth World Saxophone Congress, not just in bringing the Australian saxophone to the attention of the rest of the world, but also in terms of creating a new work for the saxophone by an Australian composer, which I'll discuss shortly. Repeatedly throughout their correspondence, Clinch lamented the lack of connection between Australian saxophonists and the global saxophone community. For example, on 13 April 1973, Clinch writes, "Is your offer for me to come to the Congress next year as a soloist still open? As I would love to come, and it would do a lot for the saxophone in this country." The request shows Clinch's desire to personally be connected to saxophonists outside Australia, as well as to forge connections more generally between Australian saxophonists and the outside world. Then, in his letter dated 7 January 1974, Clinch writes, "The Congress is creating a lot of interest in Australia for the saxophone." Here, Clinch may have meant that his saxophone students and colleagues were excited and looking forward to hearing about the Congress upon Clinch's return. Obviously, Clinch saw attending the Congress as being nationally and not just personally significant. Clinch's desire to connect the Australian saxophone with the Bordeaux saxophone community is also highlighted by his letters from 1 April 1975 and 29 April 1977. In the letter from 1 April 1975, he writes, "I know you are very busy, but could you help me, please? I have been unsuccessful in getting the following items in Australia." Here, he is asking for a transcription of a JS box suite that Londeix had made for the saxophone, as well as some recordings of Londeix performing a number of saxophone pieces. Between these two statements, it seems that Clinch was, at the very least, frustrated by the difficulty in getting Londeix's saxophone resources in Australia back in the 1970s. In his letter dated 29 April 1977, Clinch reiterates the struggle to get these saxophone resources in Australia. "I sent your tutor and many other works of yours for the syllabus of the Australian Music Examinations Board. It is very difficult to buy them in Australia, so I suggested to a good importer, Australian Principal Instruments, to get the agency for your music from Henry Lemoine, Paris. If you are speaking to Lemoine, please encourage them to allow Australian Principal Instruments to import your music to Australia. I'm about to order some music myself to help people buy it here." Now, in a subsequent letter, we find out that actually Australian Principal Instruments went out of business, but in Londeix's reply, we can see that Londeix did contact Lemoine in an effort to resolve the problem of importing saxophone works to Australia. Clinch also described the difficulty in connecting with other international saxophonists apart from the French. In a letter from 20 March 1992, he writes, "I cannot make contact with the people organizing the Congress in Italy later this year. I have written several letters, but no answers." He then asked Londeix to help him get in contact by speaking to the Italians on his behalf. Clinch ends this letter with the greatest complaint in the entire collection of letters. "We in Australia are not given any consideration within the Congress setup. So I will be running another Australian-wide sax seminar again next year," which would have been 1993, "to promote the sax better in Australia. This is obviously the only way for us to go when we are left out of all the activities." Clearly, even by 1992, connections between Australian saxophonists and saxophonists in other countries were still lacking. However, by 1992, Clinch had organized his saxophone quartet, and the Peter Clinch Quartet had already toured Japan, China, Belgium, Germany, Austria, and North America, making connections with saxophone teachers, students, and performers everywhere they went and putting the Australian saxophone on the map. In addition to painting a clearer picture of Clinch's desire and effort towards making the Australian saxophone connected to and recognized by the rest of the world, this collection of letters provides an interesting insight into the origin of one of Australia's earliest and greatest large-scale works for the saxophone, the Sonata by William Lovelock. Now, in every other available source I've found, liner notes, theses, dissertations, interviews, etc., the story goes that Lovelock wrote the Concerto for Saxophone and String Orchestra on commission in 1973 from Sir Frank Callaway for performance at a workshop in February of 1974. Callaway knew Clinch from their time together at the University of Western Australia. Clinch premiered the concerto in February of 1974 with the West Australian Symphony Orchestra. Then, after hearing Clinch perform the concerto and realizing his technical and lyrical prowess, Lovelock wrote the more technically demanding sonata. Let's listen to the first part of the second movement of this sonata. Clinch's letters of 7 January and 28 May 1974 tell a different tale. revealing that both the concerto and the sonata were commissioned by the Arts Council of Australia, specifically for Clinch to bring to the World Saxophone Congress in Bordeaux. Clinch writes, "The Australian government has just sent the notice of payment of my fares to Bordeaux next July. This is a great honor. They have also paid a commission for a saxophone concerto with string orchestra accompaniment for me to take to Bordeaux. The composer has arranged the accompaniment for piano, so it can be performed either way. Which do you want, piano or string orchestra?" Clinch then goes on to ask Londeix about how long his performance should be, how much of his program should be Australian music, and whether he should provide information about himself and the works, and so on. In the following letter, available in the collection, we find out that Londeix has asked Clinch to perform only 15 minutes of music at the Congress, and as a result, the sonata was commissioned. Clinch writes, "I first said I'll play the concerto by William Lovelock, which was 20 minutes in duration and commissioned for me to play in Bordeaux by the Arts Council of Australia. You only wanted 15 minutes, so the Arts Council commissioned this sonata, also by William Lovelock, to go 15 minutes. So the name of the sonata I will play is by William Lovelock." In other words, Clinch initially planned to play the concerto for the Congress, but since Londeix only wanted 15 minutes of music, the Arts Council commissioned Lovelock to write the sonata. According to these letters, had Londeix not requested a shorter work, Lovelock may never have had the funding or the incentive to write the sonata. It is therefore thanks to this French connection that this piece, one of the earliest staples in the Australian concert saxophone repertoire, was commissioned. Peter Clinch premiered William Lovelock's sonata for alto saxophone and piano at the 4th World Saxophone Congress in Bordeaux in July of 1974. This was the first time an Australian concert saxophonist had performed at the Congress, and according to the notes on the slipcase for Clinch's LP, Australian Music for Saxophone from 1975, the sonata was, quote, "particularly well received in Bordeaux." It must have gone well because at the 5th World Saxophone Congress held in London in July of 1976, Clinch performed Lovelock's sonata again. This time, he was given time to play a full concert, and to his program, he added Margaret Sutherland's sonata and Introspections for Saxophone and Prepared Tape, which he co-composed with Geoffrey D'Ombrain. Earlier, I discussed Clinch's desire and struggle to import French saxophone sheet music and recordings to Australia. Perhaps more importantly, Clinch wanted to introduce Londeix's saxophone method books to Australia. Retrospectively, we know that Clinch's efforts in this area made a huge impact on how saxophone is taught, particularly in Victoria. Clinch's student, Barry Cockcroft, traveled to Bordeaux and studied with Jean-Marie Londeix and Marie Bernadette Charrier. When Cockcroft returned to Australia, he incorporated the French teaching methods he learned into his own teaching. His students Joseph Lalo, Yo-Yo Su, and Jessica Voigt-Page have noted that his teaching is French influenced. In turn, Cockcroft's student Joseph Lalo also studied in Bordeaux and now teaches at the University of Melbourne, incorporating French methods into his teaching and imparting these on to the next generation. In interviews with me, Australian saxophonists Andrew Smith, Michael Lichnowsky, Aaron Royer, and Nick Fruscianiello noted that today, the Melbourne saxophone community has a significant French influence. This influence stems from Clinch's first attempts to bring Londeix's saxophone method books to Australia, detailed in this collection of letters. Already by the third letter in this collection, dated 13 April 1973, Clinch mentions that he is, quote, "anxious to know when Londeix's saxophone method book, Le Saxophone and Jouant, or Playing the Saxophone, would be published in English, because he wanted to use the method book in our schools here in Australia." Clinch reiterates this desire in his letter from 1 April 1975, when he writes, quote, "I would like to introduce your method to Australia when they are all translated into English," end quote. And again in his letter from 12 January 1976, when he says, "I want to introduce your saxophone method to Australia." In this letter, Clinch also requests urgently, in all caps and underlined, for Londeix to send him 2 method books and Debussy Syrinx so that he could include them on the AMB syllabus by March of 1976. In fact, he uses the word urgent 3 times in this one-page letter. You can see I've circled it in red here. Fortunately, Clinch's imperative tone was effective. Within a week, on 19 January 1976, Londeix replied, quote, "I'll send the specimen immediately." In addition to agreeing to send the requested materials, Londeix also volunteered to send his chart of compared fingerings for alto saxophone altissimo notes and said, "Write to me if you desire other things. I'll have pleasure to help you in this matter." Londeix was clearly willing to help Clinch spread his saxophone method books and music to Australia. We know from Clinch's letter dated 29 April 1977 that he did in fact receive these works because he says, quote, "I set your tutor and many other works of yours for the syllabus of the Australian Music Examinations Board," end quote. Then on 2 June 1977, Clinch asked Londeix if he could have Lemoine send 27 copies of Londeix's saxophone tutor books and transcriptions to him. Clinch then sold these books on to his students, including Ian Godfrey. The language used in these letters projects a sense of camaraderie, appreciation, support, and respect between these two saxophonists. The relationship led to an increased awareness of the Australian saxophone outside Australia, as well as an increased awareness of the French saxophone within Australia. These letters emphasize how difficult it was, even in the 1990s, for Australian saxophonists to connect with saxophonists outside Australia. Clinch persevered for 20 years trying to bridge this gap. He planted the seed and tended to the sapling, nurturing the roots, but unfortunately, as Clinch died in 1995, he never saw the enormous tree that his sapling became. Today, hundreds and maybe thousands of Australian saxophonists benefit from the French tutor books, music, and teachings brought over and instigated by Peter Clinch, either as a direct part of his pedagogical lineage, through the works he made part of the AMAB syllabus, or from the reputation for excellence that he fostered around the world. Thank you so much for listening.
Cool. All right. Thanks, Nessyah. That was amazing. Thank you so much. Round of applause from everyone. Thank you. Now, we might open it up to some questions. So if you have any questions about that presentation, feel free to type it in the chat. Whilst we're waiting for one, I might just open it up with these are amazing resources that you've come across, like, you know, direct correspondence between Londeix and Clinch. And I know we've talked about it before, but, you know, it's a kind of an interesting story how you actually got a hold of these, I believe. Can you tell us how you actually came to obtain these letters?
Yes, that is a bit of an interesting story. So it was a little bit tricky to, I'm seeing we've already got questions coming in. It was a little bit tricky to get a hold of these letters. And a large part of that is because my French is not good at all. And I was, to be completely honest, you know, completely starstruck and embarrassed to send a message to Londeix with my terrible French. And I was too embarrassed to send him a message in English. But what ended up happening was I was actually in the United States at the, was it the biennial conference, the North American Saxophone Alliance conference? It was the one that was it last year? Yeah, gosh, it was last year. No, yeah, it was last year. Wow. The beginning of last year. And I found out about this connection between Londeix and Peter Clinch, actually, because I just so happened to be sitting next to Kenneth Che at, you know, one of these performances. And, you know, you speak to the people you sit next to, and, you know, I just said, "Oh, Dr. Che, you know, it's really lovely to see you. And, you know, I'm doing some work on saxophone in Australia." And so he happened to mention that Peter Clinch and Jean-Marie Londeix knew each other. and that there might be something there. And so I thought, oh, I just like planted the seed in my mind. And then through some email correspondence, I ended up talking to Bill Street, who's up in Canada. I think he's still in Canada now. And I was asking him about how he knew, how Bill Street knew Peter Clinch, because Kenneth had also mentioned that they knew each other. And he said, well, actually, you should really send a message to Jean-Marie Londeix, because they really knew each other quite well. He would be the one to talk to. And I sort of said, well, you know, I'm not, my French isn't so good. And Bill Street just crushed that. He said, you know, just send him a message right away. Don't wait on it at all. And he sent a message to me and Londeix saying, you know, I'm getting you two in contact. So he sort of forced me to move forward on this, which was wonderful, because Londeix was really lovely about it. He said, oh, actually, I have this collection of letters. He's a phenomenal record keeper. And he had saved all of the letters from Peter Clinch. And so I had a friend help me, several friends actually helped me with translating my English into French. And after a number of emails, he agreed to get them all sent to me. But, you know, he's up there in age and wasn't comfortable with the technology to scan them and send them to me. And so he said, if you can get someone to do it, more power to you, like, oh, great, we'll send them to you. And so I thought, oh, well, who do I know in Bordeaux? It's about nobody. So again, I got a friend to send a quick message to Mary B, and just kind of plug my name there, and sent Mary B just an email asking, would one of your students maybe be willing to go and just go to Londeix's house, take a photo of these and send them to me, and I'll be willing to pay them. And, you know, Mary Bernadette Charrier is unbelievably kind and generous. And she said, oh, no, I'll take care of it, no problem. And so she actually went over to Londeix's house and scanned the letters and sent them to me. And that's how I got them.
Wow. It's amazing. And it's amazing.
Like all over the world to get these letters. It's crazy.
Yeah. And just, you know, all sort of came about by one sort of very, you know, casual, you know, comment. And yeah, here we are. It's amazing. And yeah, it's amazing that Londeix actually kept all these letters and, you know, kept it all documented. I'm sure he has, you know, hundreds, if not thousands of other correspondence from other saxophone players as well. So now we've got another question from Robert. His question was Clinch fluent in French at all? Because he made the observation that all the letters that we've seen so far have all been written in English. So how did that sort of work in terms of communication between the two?
Well, Londeix speaks quite good English. His English is actually great. He just prefers to speak in French. So they communicated in English as far as I'm aware. I don't think that Clinch was fluent in French, but to be honest, I don't know. That's a really great question. I'll have to ask his daughter Robin. She would know.
Yeah, I think I'll chime in here.
Sure.
I'd say it's.
Is that Tony?
Yeah.
Yes.
Stuart might confirm this. I really don't think Peter spoke any other language besides English and music. I travelled overseas with him once or twice to saxophone congresses, and I didn't hear him speak any other language besides English. He was a country boy from Geraldton. You don't pick up other languages in Geraldton.
Fair enough. No,
I don't know if you guys noticed, but Tony was in that picture of the quartet that I showed you guys.
You're looking great, Tony.
Thanks, Stu.
Ness, I don't recall Pete speaking French either, but I was not sort of with him in a context where it would have been necessary. I did go on a tour to Europe with him with the youth orchestra that he conducted when I was at uni, and I honestly can't recall him having extensive conversations, but I think he must have had some basic understanding of French. But yeah,
Probably wouldn't have even had to. I mean, with Londeix speaking such good English and everything.
Yeah, yeah.
It probably wasn't really necessary for him. Great question, though.
Yeah.
Thanks, Stu and Tony, for giving us some insight on that.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. Tony, I don't think we've actually met, but lovely to meet you. Just out of curiosity, like you said, you've toured a lot with the quartet and everything like that. I'd imagine you went to a few of these congresses as well. What was it sort of like being the underdog, I guess, being, representing Australian music and things like that? What was that sort of like at that time? Because I imagine, it was all kind of new and, I guess, it wasn't very well known what Australian classical saxophone was like.
Well, I guess for a start there, I studied with Peter at Melbourne State College from 1977 to 1980. And he started his saxophone quartet in 1977.
Mm-hmm.
And I stayed with it till 1988, I think. There was, the classical saxophone scene in Australia was very small. Essentially, Peter and his students. There was a fellow, Neville Thomas, in Sydney, who I think was a clarinet player like Peter. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't think you'd call it a classical saxophone scene like there seems to be today. People played the saxophone, and like me, I only played classical saxophone because Peter, my teacher, said you could play this, because he was trying to get people interested in it. As for touring, I went to the States. You'll see the post I put in the chat after that poster picture. The Winslow ligature dates it. Peter was a pretty sort of feisty kind of guy who didn't tolerate fools.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's why he gravitated to Londeix, because Londeix played the saxophone in a kind of a bold way, and Peter was a really bold player. So he was also quite a political kind of operator in that scene, as far as I could see. He was always looking for the next connection to make and sort of really hustling up his baby, which was getting the Australian saxophone on the world stage. So it was interesting to observe the way he hustled,
right,
and got himself into that position of being the president of the World Saxophone Congress. I think that's correct. Is that correct? He was the president of it for a while.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, it's a long time ago. So, yeah.
He was one of the, I guess, founders.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah, so he was significant, but the way he played and the way he approached his instrument was completely different to what I heard as the American school of classical saxophone at the time. So he was a bit of an outlier in that regard. So I think Londeix was a way of getting into that scene without having to necessarily be accepted by the Americans. That's just the way I saw it.
Tony, was there a connection with the Belgian saxophone quartet as well?
Yes, the Brussels Saxophone Quartet actually came out to that first seminar that you mentioned, this the first Australian Saxophone Symposium, or whatever it was. And that was my introduction to classical saxophone, actually, hearing the Brussels Saxophone Quartet. And some of those guys were billeted at my house. I was still living at home, and they came to stay out there. And yeah, there's some funny stories associated with that. Like, it was across the Easter weekend, and Good Friday came, and this is pre-opening on. Back then, Easter, like Good Friday, nothing was open. No shops, no bars, no cafes, nothing. So here were these Belgians who just wanted to drink beer, and there was nothing open. And my father was working. I don't think Yamaha had taken over a firm called Rose Music yet. But my father was working for that company. And one of the other guys who was for that company, which was involved in the seminar promoting things, was a member of the Montmorency Football Club, which is 20 kilometres out in the northeastern suburbs of Melbourne, sort of semi-rural. And he could get us into the club rooms where there was a bar with a keg. So we spent this rainy Good Friday about 4 hours through the afternoon with the Belgians drinking beer and playing saxophone quartets for us.
Sweet.
Yeah, it was an interesting introduction to the world of classical saxophone playing.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Right, I've got that's not the only connection that Peter Clinch had with the Belgian saxophone quartet. I've got some photographs of him in Europe performing with them. So
was that before they came to Australia, or just no? Or what year was that?
I believe that would be after they came to Australia, but Tony, we're gonna have to get together at some point because I've got all these photographs and I feel like you're gonna have some amazing insights and be able to help me out with a lot of this stuff.
Sure.
So I'll connect up with you after this.
Yeah, happy to.
Can I come to that session too, just as an observer?
Stuart, I still need to interview you too.
I'll just love to tag along just because I'd imagine the amazing stories. So yeah, happy to chime in if I'm allowed.
Yeah, sure.
Sure.
Now, Stu, we've got Stuart Byrne as well. Now, do you want to share, because you were kind of, I believe, and do correct me if I'm wrong, you did study with Clinch as well for a time, is that correct?
Yeah, I did. Pete was my teacher at, Ness mentioned Melbourne State College, which then became Melbourne Teachers College, or perhaps I got the wrong way around it. And then later on it became the Institute of Education. So when I was there, it was called the Institute of Education. That was 91 to 94. Mm-hmm. And Pete was my teacher, but I was a clarinet player then.
Right.
I think we had one saxophone lesson in the time that I was there, but I was a clarinet major.
Okay. Was there any, like, obviously you probably would have interacted with, parts of that saxophone class, at least, I'd imagine. Like, was there any sort of, like, what was it like, sort of, I guess, sort of, not necessarily being maybe directly involved, but sort of just sort of hearing all these wonderful sounds of saxophone coming out? Was there anything?
Oh, it was great. Ness mentioned Barry Cockcroft, so Barry and I were at uni at a similar time to each other. Mm-hmm. Ben Northey was there, or Benjamin Northey, I should say, now known as a conductor.
Yes,
was a very good classical saxophone player, but better known as a commercial saxophone player. So those sorts of guys were there. Less known, perhaps, or definitely less known than the Peter Clinch Saxophone Quartet. Pete actually started the Peter Clinch Clarinet Quartet when I was at uni. And I think, is Jeff Fague still here? Yeah, Jeff Fague and Graham Pender and I were in the Peter Clinch Clarinet Quartet until 1995 when Pete left us. But yeah, we didn't become as famous as the Saxophone Quartet.
Wow, no, it's fascinating. And we should also mention that earlier on we had Niels Bale, who is a member of the current reincarnation of the group with Lachlan Davidson as well. And he does pass on his regards to you, Ness. He had to go. He's had to do some family stuff. But yeah, they recently did a concert as well, and that was kind of interesting. And it's just, sort of hearing the presentation and hearing stories and things like that, you could definitely tell that Peter definitely had such a huge influence on the scene, not just in Victoria, but also across Australia and internationally as well. Like putting Australian saxophone on the map is no easy feat, that's for sure. Particularly being a relative outsider in comparison to sort of the more conventional schools like in Europe and America and things like that. Do we have any other questions at all for Ness about the presentation, or anything slightly off topic in relation to Peter Clinch, or maybe even for some of the for Tony or any other members? Speak now, forever hold your peace.
Well, I've got lots of questions for Tony. Locke has a question.
Yes, Lachlan?
Hey, I was just going to ask for Nessyah, so just so that we're absolutely clear, if you were to connect the Peter Clinch Australian School to like the people who are currently in Australia teaching right now, would that, so is Ian Godfrey is a Peter Clinch student?
Yes.
And I know, of course, Joseph Lalo is connected to that. Who else is currently in Australia who's, you know, branched out from that?
Great question. If you give me just a moment, I can actually show you. One of the things I've been working on is to create a pedagogical lineage web. And actually, Lachlan, you helped me with this.
Yes, I remember, yeah.
It's developed quite a bit since then. And once I open it up, you might be impressed, Locke. It's a little bigger than it was. Basically, it shows how interwoven this network is. Just give me a moment to pull it up for you guys. Let's see. Can you guys see this? It's very small. So this is the current state of how this web looks. So it's vaguely geographically oriented. So this area here is Melbourne-ish, Victoria. This area here is Sydney. Perth is all of this over here. And then over here, I'm starting to work on Brisbane, Queensland, and whatnot. What you'll notice is Peter Clinch is right there. And if you trace out his connections, he is linked to virtually everyone on this chart, either directly or through somebody he taught. So for example, Peter Clinch was in a quartet. So we're wondering, well, what about Perth, right? So Peter Clinch was in a quartet with Tom Martin, who's right here. There's Tom. And this dotted arrow, let me zoom back out so you can see, that dotted arrow goes to Peter Clinch. Oh no, wait, that one goes to Ian Godfrey. All right, so we've got a dotted arrow to Ian Godfrey. But basically, they were all, he was in a quartet with Peter Clinch. Where's the one that's to Clinch? There's the one that's to Clinch, all right. So they were all in a quartet together. So Peter Clinch taught Tom Martin via the quartet, essentially. And then Tom Martin taught, you can see over here. So Tom Martin was in a quartet with Simon Stiles and taught Simon Stiles via a quartet. And then Simon taught Matthew Stiles, who's taught basically everybody else in Perth. So if you look at the connections, virtually everybody is connected to Peter Clinch in some way, not necessarily directly, but through one of his students or through someone he was in a quartet with and they had a strong connection because of the quartet, that kind of thing.
Wow.
Yep.
It's pretty cool seeing, yeah, because I know I've seen you show this before, and yeah, it sort of really puts it in perspective, like how it's all sort of interconnected, and it's sort of that essentially a family tree of teaching and students, and it's fascinating to see how it's all connected, and it's some level there is some connection between all the different players.
Right, and actually, before Michael Duke came to Sydney, that Nathan, your whole cohort that, you guys had a little bit of a Mark Walton school going on. But now a bunch of you have studied with Michael Duke, who connects back up to Peter Clinch. So prior to that, there wasn't so much of this Peter Clinch connection in Sydney. It was more of the Mark Walton school in Sydney. But now it's kind of linked back up.
Yeah, which is pretty cool.
Clinch.
Now, Tony's typed in, he's just documented the first iteration of the Peter Clinch quartet, which formed in 1977, was Peter, Graham Shilton, Ian Godfrey, and himself on baritone saxophone. Yeah, that's I think that was the photo that you showed us earlier on with that first iteration, I believe. Or no?
No, I don't think it was.
Okay.
That was a later iteration. I can check that.
Yeah, there were. I'll just chime in.
Yeah.
Can you hear me better now? Actually, I'll turn my volume up.
No, it's good.
That was the first one, and then Jock, we called him, Tom Martin, joined. Graham left. I moved to alto. Ian moved to baritone, and Jock played tenor. And then a few years later, when Jock, for some reason, couldn't do it anymore because of his commitments in the army, I think, Mark Franklin, who's the tenor player in that picture, joined.
Right.
He'd been a player in the RAF band here, and he was a school teacher and really nice jazz tenor player. Heard him on a gig one night and said, "Hey, you will need to join our saxophone quartet." Yeah.
Cool.
I'm interested, Ness, in your chart. Does it document all the students of Peter's, and in a sense students of mine too, who haven't become classical saxophone players?
Great question.
Who've then, particularly at the college through that time, the 1970s and 80s, who then went out to high schools, and for the last 20 years, every music department in a school in Victoria basically has been run by a graduate of Melbourne State College. And most of the saxophone teaching has been from students who went through at that time. So if you included that web, like, for example, Julian Wilson, are you aware of Julian Wilson? Who's a great jazz saxophone player. He was a student of mine when he was at high school, just for a couple of years. There's lots of players, because I don't call myself a classical player, and that's because I have never really been interested in classical saxophone. I grew up listening to jazz thanks to my dad, who was a jazz saxophone player from Perth, and that actually comes to how I was introduced to Peter, because my dad used to play with Peter in the 1950s in Perth.
Right.
So we hooked up in Melbourne when I was finishing school and wanting to go to uni, and Dad took me along and introduced me to Peter.
Right. Well, Tony, you and I are going to have a more in-depth conversation later.
Yeah.
And if, in case I didn't mention this to everybody, Tony Hicks is on my list of people who I really need to interview, but I haven't had a chance to connect up with him yet. So this is great because now I can coerce him into doing an interview.
No problem. Come and hang out.
Absolutely. So the chart that I've been working on, the way it's been constructed is by word of mouth, by asking people to contribute, because there's no other way to find out this information aside from asking people who studied from whom, who do you know who studied from whom, because the vast majority of this information is not available in any other format. Now, the people who are included are people who have at some point made concert saxophone or classical saxophone performance or teaching a career. So in other words, they had to have been paid for either teaching or performing or both in a classical capacity. So if they studied, for example, let's say they studied in uni and they never performed publicly, and after uni, they never did anything with saxophone again. they're not going to be included. But somebody who teaches, let's say they went to uni and then they now teach saxophone in a high school, absolutely, because they are, making a profession out of teaching concert saxophone. So those people would be included. So I'm definitely looking forward to Tony's contributions, which will definitely make that chart even bigger.
No.
But people who are exclusively jazzers, I'm not including, just because if I start getting into the whole jazz thing, it just opens a whole can of worms. And
well, that's a PhD on itself, I think.
Yeah, that's like a PhD for 3 people right there. So the whole jazz, I mean, I'm gonna have to include people who play jazz, obviously, because you can't cut them out. But if they haven't done anything in the classical realm, then I'm not really going to be talking about them much.
Yeah, which is an interesting way of looking at it.
So, for example, Tony, you're on there because you have performed professionally classical concert saxophone music.
Yeah.
So regardless of how you see yourself, you have to be included.
Oh, look, I was listening to a recording I made at the end of last year, almost free jazz, and I'm a classical saxophone player in bits. All the technique that you develop playing classical saxophone. So yeah, that there's an influence there, and it brings me to one of the interesting things about Peter's teaching, which wasn't to do with aligning yourself with any one particular school or genre or kind of style or whatever. His approach for me anyway as a teacher was to learn how to play the saxophone properly, and then you can play whatever you want. So I understand that the logistical issues, if you're going to include every saxophone player who's learned from someone who's learned from someone who's learned from someone who learned from Peter. But I suspect that there is a way of playing the saxophone which Peter's teaching, well, say, taught me. It showed me how the saxophone could be played. And then I teach my students in the same, to achieve the same results. So there is a direct influence. They might be jazz saxophone players now, and done some classical at high school, but there's a way of playing the saxophone which is there's a direct lineage to Peter's approach. Yeah,
definitely.
All right, we should probably wrap it up soon, but there's just a couple of quick questions before we finish up. One from Stuart, directed at Tony, in fact. Did Philip, Michelle, and Pete ever play saxophone together?
There was a rivalry between the two, I think. Okay. Philip Michelle was actually an extraordinary classical saxophone player. I remember once being asked to go along to a recording session with some Melbourne Symphony Orchestra musicians. I can't remember what it was even that we were playing. But I turned up and there's Philip with his alto. I was playing second to Philip playing it first alto, and it was extraordinary classical saxophone playing. But because they had there was a tension between the two, I don't think they would have got together and played for fun. They may have played together in a professional context. And they certainly would have played together in the Melbourne Symphony Orchestra playing clarinets, and Philip playing clarinet and Peter playing saxophone and things like that. Yeah.
Okay. No, thank you for that. Now, there's one, this is a bit of a doozy question from Matthew, in a good way. It's just, I feel this could open a can of worms, but it says here, saxophone seems to have had a surprisingly short history. This is not incorrect, but with not many participants, do you think learning an instrument will become a thing of the past? That's a big can of worms, sure, because, we can talk all night and debate all this sort of thing, but I think maybe we'll save that one for another time, because that's slightly a different topic, I think. But look, are there any final questions for Ness on the topic, or any of the other audience participants regarding Peter and the Londeix letters and all that? If not, we might call it an evening. Okay, cool. Well, thank you again, Ness, for your time and your presentation. It was absolutely thrilling and enthralling. As I said, there's lots of things there that I hadn't been made aware of in the past, and it was really insightful for me, and hopefully a lot of other people got something out of this as well. Also, a big thank you to some of the participants this evening, of course, Tony and Stu, and for your input on Peter and his influence as well. It was just added just a nice touch to the evening in terms of having that sort of first-hand recount of, you know, those experiences and things there. But yeah, again, thank you very much for joining us, and again, thank you, Ness. It was absolute pleasure, and I know you have a website with some details, and I know you've got some other things, and of course you're finishing up the PhD, which is a monumental task. Trust me, I know from first-hand experience. But again, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much for having me. It was really, really fun to be here, and especially fun to have Stu and Tony here to share some really unique experiences. Thanks, guys.
Yeah, exactly. And again, thank you all for tuning in. Please be sure to stay tuned with other things we have coming up. So just be on the Facebook, which will be on the link below. But until then, stay safe, and we'll see you next time. Thank you.